The next speaker is Tom Perls. He's a professor of medicine and he directs the New England Centurion study. Centenarian, oh, are the Centurion here? Oh, it's misspelled. I was wondering, is that back to the Roman Empire? So, and he comes from Boston University. I did my postdoc at BU, so it reminds me of happy memories there. The talk is The Nurture and Nature of Exceptional Longevity. He's famous because he's managed to track down every centenarian on the planet. And so I hope to be part of his study soon. No, well, not too soon.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Really glad you got plied with all these delicious snacks. I want to thank Sanjay very much for having me, and to the whole committee and group that put, I think, just an absolutely amazing symposium together. Excluding myself, I think it's just been a terrific symposium so far, and really, really, you know, cutting edge presentations, and I'm very, very appreciative and learning a lot. So let me, mine's not going to be so intense in terms of some of the data and basic science. I'm going to talk to you about the oldest people in the world. The title of the talk is Nature and Nurture of Exceptional Longevity, and I did use Wisconsin colors. That's right. So, for especially some of the younger folks in the audience, I thought I'd ask you, how old do you want to be? 60? 70? Maybe 80? How about 90? 100? No? Maybe? 110? So, our study, we have a couple of studies, the New England Centenarian study and the Long Life Family study. The New England Centenarian study has enrolled about 2,800 centenarians. It was now about a total sample of 3,000 subjects, 2,500 of which are centenarians and 500 are their kids. Kids are not the kids we think of, they're people in their 70s and 80s. And we've been enrolling them since 1995 with the goal of discovering genetic and non-genetic determinants of exceptional longevity. Keep in mind that exceptional longevity is 30 or 40 years past the median survival of the 1900 birth cohort. So just to kind of depict that for you, for those born in 1900, median survival, that is, half people died before the age of 67 and half people died after. About 5% had the opportunity to live to about age 92, and only 0.2% had the opportunity to live to 100 and older. These numbers actually change quite a bit, and it speaks to, with more recent birth cohorts, and it speaks to the real importance when studying exceptional longevity to keep in mind when people are born, because the various secular events that people go through over the years are very, very different, and what it takes to get to 100 or 105, maybe not so much 110, can be tremendously different from one birth cohort to another. Now, with regard to the study of exceptional longevity, which can be quite a sensational area, I thought I'd speak to a little bit about kind of a little bit up Luigi Ferrucci's alley in terms of allocation of resources at the NIA, what it takes to research people who are going to live to their 70s and keep them happy versus what it might take to get people to live to be 1,000. Here's Ezekiel Emanuel, who had a very, very controversial article in The Atlantic that he titled, "Why I Hope to Die at 75." He actually ended up being the keynote speaker at a recent Gerontological Society of America meeting. I thought he was going to get booed off the stage because of this article. But he actually gave a really fantastic talk about the Affordable Care Act and why it was so successful and good for older people in Medicare. But I think he was just trying to be very thought-provoking in the end with this article. But there are those who think we shouldn't really devote any resources to older people, that, Leon Cass, who was the head of a bioethics committee under George Bush, may have been one of those. But we would call those the purists. And then there's this guy named Jack LaLanne who really promoted healthy aging with his exercise and tremendous optimism, and really kind of thought people could live to their late 80s, almost 90, with just really taking good care of themselves. And I'm actually one of these folks, and I would call myself a realist, as biased as that might be. Then there's the quacks, who are the anti-aging industry and say that they can get everybody to be 120 and they can stop and reverse aging, just take their hormones. And these are things like growth hormone, testosterone, DHEA, a number of other hormones that I actually call toxic metabolic soups. And there's tremendous adverse effects with these. A bunch of this activity is actually illegal, but they're still making a lot of money. Then there are the futurists, or pseudoscientists, people that I would say like Ray Kurzweil, who says he's taking 120 pills a day to try and stave off aging until the right technology, like little nanorobots running around in your blood to clean up bad cells and things, is invented. And Aubrey de Grey, who thinks that there is a baby boomer today that will benefit from science that will result in them living to be 1,000. So that's kind of the spectrum. And along those lines, I put a graph at the top about allocation of resources. And to me, the kind of things Aubrey is talking about, one might as well try to build a space shuttle that'll take a bunch of people to Pluto. That would be pretty expensive. So, and then the purists don't cost anything, but somewhere in between, I think, there's the sweet spot. So here's our two studies. The Long Life Family Study is a cooperative study with the National Institute on Aging. It's been going on since about 2004, and we're following 550 families that show dramatic clustering for exceptional longevity, with the aim of finding what these individuals have in common that may explain their propensity for longevity. And then the New England Centenarian Study, which I've already described. Just a little lingo, there's supercentenarians are people who live to 110 and older. We've accumulated 150 of those. They're really rare. They're about 1 per 5 million in the population. So we have to be looking worldwide for individuals like that. And we go through a lot of trouble to make sure that they are the ages that they are, with various forms of proof. And semi-supercentenarians are people 105 to 109, and that's become our age cutoff now for our study. It used to be we looked at people in their late 90s, and now we make centenarians laugh when they call us up on the phone and they want to be in the study and they're 103 and we tell them they're too young. And just stick around and maybe we'll love to study you later. When we get a lot more money, hopefully someday, then we can do some longitudinal studies where we can enroll people at much earlier ages and follow them over time. We do a longitudinal study, but we need to be pretty choosy right now. This is a picture of one of our really interesting families. The lady in the purple is Sarah Knaus, who was the oldest ever in our study at 119. And really the proof of her age is in this picture, because seated in red is her daughter Kitty, who became 100. And within the year of this photo. standing behind them is the 78-year-old grandson, the 49-year-old great-granddaughter, then seated below is a 20-something great-great-granddaughter, and then the little kid is the great-great-great-grandson, or 6 living generations. There's a couple of other families like this, but they're families where there was a long tradition in the family of the women having children at young ages. And that's another way you can get a 6th-generation family. This is me when I had dark hair. And that wasn't very long ago. I guess there's been some stress in my life, but really I'm okay. And this is Walter Bruning, who I traveled out to see my cousin, but also to see Walter in Great Falls, Montana. He lived to be 114 and the oldest man in the world. And, you know, he's in a suit and tie, and he's not decrepit in a nursing home bed. He was in assisted living only because of just some frailty stuff going on. But what was remarkable to me is I would sit down with him and he talked my ear off for 90 minutes without repeating himself, without any issues that I could see. You know, later we did detailed neurocognitive testing, and that revealed that he really had no deficits at 114-year-old brain without cognitive deficits. And for those who think that Alzheimer's or other dementias are a natural, inevitable consequence of aging, that's not true. And I've got some supercentenarians to prove it. That's not to say that had Walter had the opportunity to live to 120, that he wouldn't have developed some dementia at that point, but certainly he's delayed age-related diseases by a huge amount. So this is Madame Calment, who is the oldest ever at 122 and 167 days. She died in 1997 from the south of France. And she held the record for being the oldest person ever for quite some time, such that every day she lived, she extended human lifespan by a day. So she had this tremendous responsibility to the human race. And the thing is she was smoking a cigarette a day, and if she just hadn't smoked that cigarette, now she's pretty frail in this. They were doing a video of her, and I think she was singing the French national anthem or what have you, but she had some short-term memory loss. She was quite frail physically and cognitively, I would say. But this is a picture of her at 116. And I just think a picture tells 1,000 words here in just terms of how incredibly slowly these people are aging and what kind of different trajectory they are on. And it's that different trajectory that gets me up in the morning, okay? This is Sarah Knaus in that from that photo shoot that was done for Life magazine with her cute relative there. And then this is her at 99. And that's without Botox, okay? So again, another indication of what kind of trajectory these folks are on. So this is just a kind of a sampling of some of our other subjects. Most of them are women, and that's the case for centenarians. About 85 to 90% of centenarians are women, which is very interesting. And also interesting, they tend to be short and stocky, like the Queen Mum. I don't know if there's something going on with growth hormone there, but that's kind of interesting to me. In the middle is one of the kids, and that woman is in her 70s with her mom. That's me with Nelson McNutt. What a great name. He's from the town I'm in New England, in Boston, near Boston. And he found out about me through the local newspaper and at 100, and had never been to a doctor. and thought it was time to find a doctor. So he saw I was the head of the New England Centenarian Study and asked if I would do that. And I had to choose between him being my subject versus being a patient, and I took the latter. He's here telling me that the secret is Brussels sprouts. And I, at the time, did not like Brussels sprouts. So I was pretty bummed. But the other interesting thing is he's kind of tall and thin. The morphology of men is a little different and kind of, and not like the women, interestingly, but they do tend to be thin, as you saw with Walter as well. But men, I'm not going to speak too much about it today, but it really is interesting, this difference between men and women and how they age and how they get to these most extreme ages, because they do seem very, very different. Just briefly about age claims. The oldest ever, as I said, is 122. Every now and then we'll see somebody claim to be 127, 133, even in the Scientific American. I guess probably the biggest proof, best proof of why they're not those ages is why didn't we hear about them when they were passing the record of 122. But there's many different reasons why we see ages crop up like that. Whether it be some kind of religious myth, a village elder, some kind of fountain of youth thing like the glacial milk of the Andes or pomegranate juice or whatever. Nationalistic pride. There was not only the space race of the Soviet Union with the United States, but there was also the age race when they were claiming these folks from Azerbaijan who were in their 140s, 150s. We actually came up with a couple of guys who we said were alive during the Civil War, but what that ended up being was some military pension fraud. So there's that. There's some other various forms of reasons for this, but really I think 122 is a pretty good guess of what the oldest human ever has been. But it's really important that when you start looking at ages 115 and older, where 99% of claims are false, that you have to, do all kinds of things like a birth certificate, maybe some other records that agree with one another if a birth certificate isn't available, and doing something called familial reconstitution, where you look at the ages of all the family members and make sure that they make sense with one another. So if your mom had you at age 10, that's probably not right. So there's a really important hypothesis in this area that was developed by Jim Fries that was published in the New England Journal back in 1981 called the compression and morbidity hypothesis, that posits that as you approach the limits of lifespan, you have to compress the time that you're sick towards the end of your life. Otherwise, you're not going to get there. And after we had enough people actually approaching limits of lifespan, that is 110 and older, we looked at this question more carefully. We had done so before in an earlier paper when the oldest individuals in our study were around 101. And there we didn't see a compression of morbidity. What we saw was a compression of disability. And that is, we saw these folks that we categorized into people called survivors, delayers, and escapers, where we saw 100-year-olds with 20, 30 years of history of age-related diseases. But they weren't really, so they weren't compressing even things like heart disease and stroke. What they were compressing was disability. So somehow they weren't dying from these diseases. They were dealing with them so much better that they were only experiencing disability in the last, 5 or 6 years of their lives, even in the presence of those diseases. So they were still dealing with them much better than others, and that's kind of interesting. And also, it was the women who tended to be more the survivors and the delayers, survivors having age-related diseases before the age of 65, and delayers having age-related diseases between the ages of 80, 85, and 100. And the women, one of their secrets to longevity is that they, compared to men, handle age-related diseases much, much better than men. the men much more readily die from the diseases and the women live with the diseases. That's why we see chronic illnesses much more commonly among the women than we do among the men. The other thing that we see that sounds a little paradoxical is that even though men are far fewer, about 10 to 15% of centenarians, they tend to be in much better shape. And that's because they're the select survivor cohort, in that if they get a disease in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they're much more readily die from them. And the guys who are living beyond that, well, they've gotten over the hump. They have some kind of resistance to these diseases. So by the time you see men about 100, they tend to be in fantastic shape, like Walter or like Nelson and others. And if they do have age-related diseases, boy, they go quick. So that's when I hear about a male centenarian. As a betting guy, I'll say that they're probably in pretty good shape, whereas women can really have quite a spectrum. And if men develop a dementia, that's a very short process, which is really interesting compared to the women. So in this graph, this is what we did later, when instead of looking at a mean age of 101 or 102, we then had a bunch of people getting to 105 to 109 and then to 110 and older. And the black line are some controls, and this is controls, and this is disease-free survival. So the controls have this pretty long period of time from here to here when this line starts to come down of morbidity. But then as you get into these other folks, like these are the nonagenarian, these are siblings of the centenarians who died in their 90s, they have a much shorter period of time. And then the people 100 to 104, even shorter, and then the semi-supers and then the supers have really short periods of time that they're experiencing disability, such that on average, the supercentenarians are experiencing both morbidity and disability only the last 5 years of their incredibly long lives. So let me get into the title of the talk finally, of the nature versus nurture question. And I'm sorry about the Spanish, because I borrowed this slide from a talk I recently gave to a Spanish-speaking group. I think one of the answers to this question comes from the Seventh-day Adventists, because they have the longest average life expectancy of any group I know of, about 86 years for men and 89 years for women. And they're a very diverse group in terms of ethnicity and geographic location. But what they do have in common are health-related behaviors that their religion asks them to participate in. So they're vegetarian, they don't smoke, they don't drink, they regularly exercise, and they spend quite a bit of time with family and religion that may play a role in managing stress better. And lo and behold, they have this average life expectancy of 88 years. They're really no different than everybody in this audience in terms of their genetic makeup. They have this average set of genes. We all have this average set of genes. And with this blueprint that I think if we take advantage of those genes with really good behaviors, this is what you get. And if intuitively, it makes total sense that if you're going to trash your opportunity with drinking too much, not exercising, getting fat, smoking, stressing yourself out to beat the band, then it makes sense you're going to die in your 50s and 60s, maybe your 70s. I see it all the time at Boston Medical Center, both ends of the spectrum. So there's a nice little acronym I came up with for remembering these things, of what it takes, of aging spelled the British way, A being attitude in terms of it may not be so much the amount of stress that matters, it's how you manage that stress that is key. The genetics, I'll show you some evidence that I think genes actually play an increasingly important role with these older and older ages. Exercise, I think there's a pretty good literature that says exercise 30 minutes a day. Interests, we've already heard a little bit about how being cognitively active, challenging your brain may improve cognitive reserve. It's a little soft and controversial, but I don't see the harm, frankly. Nutrition, there, I just advocate that people have a healthy diet that, hard to define what I mean by healthy diet, but rather a diet that puts you at a weight that makes you feel healthy and good. For some, that's being a little overweight. For others, you usually know what weight is slowing you down versus what makes you feel good. And then get rid of the smoking and the anti-aging quackery. I have a life expectancy calculator that's been on the internet a long time at livingto100.com, and it uses this reasoning and having you answer about 40 questions over 7 minutes, and it'll tell you exactly the day you will die. And honestly, it's very much just to be used as an educational tool, right? And it tells you a little prescription at the end of the things you're doing right or wrong, and the vaccinations you should be getting, and the various tests you should be doing, screenings you should be doing for your age and sex, given the age that you tell it you are at. So have fun with that. Just one other quick little thing. I'll get an email every now and then from somebody in their late 90s or early hundreds and say that your calculator says I should be dead. And I say, well, actually, that's really good news for you, because it means that you probably had some pretty bad health behaviors, but you've got some great genes making up for it. So what about evidence that it's not so much nurture, but it's nature, that it's genes? There's a big literature out there to say that about 70% of aging is in your hands, that it's your health-related behaviors, and about 20 to 30% is your genes. And that totally agrees with the Seventh-day Adventist health data, that for average people, getting to these older ages around almost 90 is going to be, the vast majority of the variation in living to those ages is going to be explained by health-related behaviors. But the twin studies from Scandinavia that were also used to come up with similar numbers, the oldest individuals in those studies were in their mid-80s. So that only tells you what it takes to get to your mid to late 80s. And it's actually a problem in the gerontological literature, this confusion over what people call aging, lifespan, longevity, exceptional longevity, so on and so forth. We've come up with what we hope is a fairly objective definition, which is taking into account what birth cohort you're talking about. We say it's the oldest 1 percentile of a birth year cohort, which is the end of a curve. So, and so when we try to bring studies together for meta-analyses and for comparing studies, I think people are all going into that fold now of using that kind of definition, and whether it be the oldest 1 percentile or the oldest 0.1 percentile for that matter. There's some evidence from our studies and from others showing that there could be an increasingly important genetic component for explaining the variation and getting to these older ages into the 90s, 100s, and 110. Things like the familial clustering, that the siblings of centenarians have markedly increased sibling relative risks for getting to older ages themselves. The offspring in many cases seem to be following in the footsteps of their parents in terms of markedly delayed rates of age-related diseases compared to other people born around the same time. And then there's additional literature to show that the power to discover genetic variants associated with exceptional longevity increases, say, from looking at people in their 90s versus people living into their early hundreds. So if there is a genetic component here that is decipherable. Another question asks, is it a lack of disease-associated genetic variants, or is it the presence of longevity-associated or protective variants? And we, in the latent longevity study, and then later the Ashkenazi Jewish centenarian study that has gone through different names. Now it's the Longevity study from near Barzilai. They found, actually, or we all found, that the centenarians have just as many of these disease-associated variants, save for a few exceptions like apolipoprotein E4, which is very rare. It's already a rare variant, but it's even more rare in the centenarians. But other than that one, for the most part, they have just as many disease-associated variants as the rest of the population, which leaves only one other possibility, and that is the presence of protective variants that seem to be slowing down aging and decreasing risk for age-related diseases. So we published a study in which we did a large genome-wide association study. Well, large for centenarian studies. At the time it was about 900 centenarians. Because we really didn't find any variants associated with longevity that met genome-wide associated levels of significance, controlling for multiple comparisons, instead a professor I work with, Paolo Sebastiani, who's an expert in Bayesian statistics, looked at the probabilities of association of these 250,000 variants, one at a time, with exceptional longevity. And she ranked them according to those probabilities, and found that once, if she just looked at the top 280 variants that were associated with 130 different genes, that ended up a pretty good model for predicting at least people who got to 106 and older. And if you try to use those same variants as a genetic signature in predicting people who got to 100 or 101, the model performed very poorly. But the model got better and better for picking out people 106. And so that increasing trend of sensitivity, which led to an 85% accuracy when looking just at people really 110 and older, spoke to a very strong genetic influence upon living to these very old ages. I'm going to end there. This is some of the advertising with the anti-aging industry. And then later I'll answer some questions. Thank you.